She slid the folder across the table and tapped it twice with one nail. The way you'd point at a dog that had made a mess on the rug. Just sign where Lyle marked it. Marin. Blood signs for blood. 6 years I'd cared for my grandmother and kept her orchard alive, and not one of them had ever paid me $1. Here is what my family did not know. That morning, my signature was already on 2 documents in that lawyer's office, notarized and stamped and perfect, and I had never signed a single one of them. I walked out of that building with a green tin box under my arm, a thin folder, and $61 to my name. Today, I prove forged signatures on dying people's documents. For a living, I am the person the county calls when somebody fakes a dead woman's hand. Last spring, I finally examined the ones my own family faked in my grandmother's name, and I made every stolen year answer for itself, to the dollar and to the date. My name is Marin Halloway. I am 38 years old. And if you have ever been the one your family counted on for everything and counted as nothing, stay with me. Because the quietest thing in that lawyer's office was about to become the thing that set me free. Welcome to Plain Spoken, the channel where ordinary people stop apologizing, keep their dignity, and let the paper do the talking. If a quiet reckoning is your kind of story, you are in the right place. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. And subscribe so the next one comes and finds you. Let me take you back to the room where it started. The Brandt Law Office in Cobb's Hollow has one conference room. And 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, my whole family came to fill it. My father, Gordon Halloway, sat at the head of the table, like he was chairing a meeting he'd already won. My mother, Diane, sat to his right, with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. My brother Kurt leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, already smiling the smile he gets when he thinks somebody's about to be told something for their own good. And Lyle Brandt, the family lawyer for 30 years, sat at the foot of the table, with a stack of papers squared off in front of him, like a man who keeps his desk clean, because his conscience isn't. I had buried my grandmother 13 days before. I had washed her. Near the end, I had learned to crush her pills into applesauce, because she'd stopped being able to swallow them whole. I had slept in the chair beside her bed for the last 9 weeks of her life, so she would not wake up alone. And now, I was sitting in a conference room, while a lawyer told me what she'd left me. Your grandmother's estate is straightforward, Lyle said. He had a soft, careful voice, the kind that makes everything sound like a kindness. The orchard and the land pass to Gordon. As the surviving son, there is a typed will, properly witnessed, dated last spring. Everything's in order. I asked to see it. He turned it so it faced me, but kept 2 fingers on the corner. The way you'd let a child look at something without letting them hold it. I read it twice. It left $2.1 million in land and business to my father. And it did not mention me at all. Not the cottage. Not $1 for the 6 years. Nothing. Uff. There is also this, Lyle said, and he slid 2 more pages across the table, a disclaimer of interest and a caregiver compensation waiver. You signed these back in January, just confirming you remember. For the file, I looked down at my own name, my signature in blue ink on both pages. A notary stamp beside each one, Lyle's commission, dated the 18th of January, a line that said I voluntarily and knowingly disclaimed any interest in the estate of Vera Halloway, a line that said I waived any and all claim to compensation, for caregiving services rendered. My mother reached over and tapped the page twice. Just sign where Lyle marked the new copy. Sweetheart. Blood signs. For blood. We keep this in the family. Here is the thing about that moment that I have thought about 1,000 times since. I did not feel rage. I felt cold, and I felt clear, and I felt the floor of my whole life shift 1 inch to the left, because I knew exactly where I had been on the 18th of January. I had been 400 miles away, in another state, sitting in a hotel conference room with a plastic badge clipped to my jacket, listening to a man explain how forgers press too hard on the downstroke. I had not been within 400 miles of Lyle Brandt's notary stamp. I did not say any of that. I have learned that you do not show a man your cards across his own table. I stood up. I picked up the green tin box my grandmother had pressed into my hands the last week. She was lucid. The one with her recipe cards in it that I'd brought to the funeral and never put down. I said, I'd like a copy of everything, mailed and emailed both. Lyle blinked. Kurt laughed, that easy laugh, and said, Marin, don't make this a thing. You always make it a thing. My father did not look at me. He looked at the window, the same way he looks at a field he is about to clear. I walked out. The door settled, shut behind me. I sat in my car in the gravel lot for a while, with the tin in my lap and my heart going slow and hard. And I did the math on what I had left. My grandmother gone. My 6 years. Erased on paper. A signature in that building that was mine. And wasn't. And a bank account that, after the funeral flowers I'd paid for myself, read $61 and change. There was no version of that morning where I got those 6 years back, but there was a version where I found out who took them, and I am very, very good at finding out. If you've ever sat in a room while your own family rewrote your history to your face and smiled while they did it, you already know the particular silence I drove home in. Stay with me, because the tin in my lap was about to matter more than the whole orchard. People in Cobb's Hollow thought I was the Halloway who never amounted to anything. The truth was duller and worse than that. Let me tell you who we were, because you can't understand what they did to me until you understand the name. My grandmother, Vera Halloway, came to Tillman County as a young widow in the 1960s, with 2 suitcases and a cutting from an apple tree wrapped in a wet rag. She bought 40 acres of rocky hill nobody wanted, and she grafted and pruned and waited. And by the time I was a girl, Halloway Orchards and Cider Mill was the place the whole county drove out to in October. There is a Halloway Hall at the Grange. There is a Halloway blend they sell at the co-op. When people in that town said the name, they said it like a season. My father took what Vera built and ran it for the last 20 years. And he wore the name like a crown he'd forged himself. Even though every root of it was hers, I was the granddaughter who left. I'd gone to the city at 22, worked my way through a forensic accounting program, and started building a real career, reading the paper trails people leave when they steal. And then, about 7 years ago, Vera started forgetting things. The stove, left on, the same story, twice, in an hour. The orchard's books, which she'd kept by hand in green ledgers for 50 years, started filling up with errors that the bank began to notice. My father's answer was to put Kurt in charge of the books and hire a part-time girl for Gran. Within a year, the orchard was 3 months behind on a property tax payment and sliding toward a lien. And the part-time girl had quit because Gran had wandered off twice. So I did what the responsible one always does. I came home. I told everyone. It was temporary. I rebuilt the orchard's books in a single brutal winter, found the tax error that had triggered the lien, and saved the place from the county. You know what my father said? When the lien cleared, he told the men at the co-op that Kurt had tightened things up. I sat at the kitchen table and heard him say it through the screen door, and I said nothing, because fighting your own father in public felt like setting fire to the house you were standing in. That is the weakness nobody in my family ever noticed in me. Because it always worked in their favor, I carry other people's mistakes, like rent I owe. Over-responsible. An old boss called it once. In my family, they had a different word for it. They called it loyalty, and they spent it like it was free. That was the first incident. There were others, and they all rhymed. Here is the second, and it is the one that should have warned me. 3 years into my caregiving, the orchard needed a new line of credit, and the bank wanted a second name on the loan, because my father's debt to income looked thin that year. He sat me down at that same kitchen table, slid a loan document across it, and said, "Sign here, Marin. Blood signs for blood." I read it twice, the way I read everything twice. It made me personally liable for $200,000 of orchard debt, while giving me no ownership of the orchard at all. I said I'd co-sign if my name went on the deed. My father stood up, looked at the wall, and said the line I'd hear in my head for years afterward: Halloways don't beg, and they don't bill family. He didn't speak to me for 9 days. On the 10th day, my mother came to my room with a casserole and a story about how much this would hurt my father's heart, and I signed it. $200,000 of liability. And not 1 inch of ground. Write that one down, because it comes back. The third incident is the one I didn't see for what it was until much later. And it is the reason I am telling you this story, instead of living a quieter one. About a year before she died, on one of her good afternoons, Vera caught my wrist while I was changing her bedsheets and held it hard. She was clearer than she'd been in weeks. She said, "Marin, they'll try to redo my hand after I am gone. You watch them." I put it where the brick is loose, by the hearth, and I put it in my own writing so no man can argue it. Then her face went soft and far away, and she asked me if the gallus were ripe yet, and the lucid window closed. I thought it was the dementia talking. I want you to hear that, because it is the part I am not proud of. My grandmother told me where she'd hidden the truth, in plain words, a year before they used my forged name to bury me, and I tucked it away as the wandering of a sick old woman's mind. The loose brick by the hearth. Remember it. Wamber. I almost didn't. That is where you have to understand who held me together that year, because I'd have come apart without her. Her name was Beatrice Okafor, B. She was the hospice nurse the agency sent for Vera's last 4 months. A wide, unhurried woman in her 60s who had buried more people than anyone I'd ever met, and somehow carried no death on her at all. She didn't try to fix me. That was the thing. Everyone else in my life had a plan for my feelings. Bea just worked beside me. 2 women turning a frail body so it wouldn't get sores. And she let me be quiet. One night near the end, I was sitting on the cottage steps after my father had come and gone, after he'd stood in the doorway and asked Bea, in front of me, whether Vera was still competent to sign things, and then left, without once touching his mother's hand. I was shaking. Bea sat down next to me on the cold step and didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said the thing I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, Anybody can forge a name, Marin. Nobody can forge who was in the room. I didn't know yet how exactly true that would turn out to be. I just knew it landed somewhere deep and stayed. Anybody can forge a name. Nobody can forge who was in the room. Hold on to that one. It is the whole story. So that is the woman I was when I walked out of Lyle Brandt's office, with a tin box and $61 erased on paper. And here is where my family made the mistake of their lives. They thought erasing me on paper was the end of it. They forgot what I do for a living. Let me show you the years they thought broke me fast, because they didn't. I went back to the city, and I went back to work, and I poured everything I had into becoming the best in the room. Not at revenge, at reading paper. I got my certification in forensic document analysis. I took the courses on question signatures, on ink dating, on the physics of a forged stroke, the way a real signature flows from muscle memory, and a fake one is drawn like a picture. Slow, with little tremors where the forger pauses to check the model. I started taking cases for the county, then the state. Elder financial exploitation. Mostly forged powers of attorney. Deeds that pulled a dying parent's house out from under them. Caregiver waivers that nieces and nephews, and, yes, sons, signed in somebody else's name. I became, in 3 hard years, exactly the person my family would least want looking at those 2 pages. They slid across the table, and for a long time I didn't look, because grief makes cowards of competent people. And because some part of me still wanted to believe my own father couldn't have done it. Then the orchard tried to sell my grandmother's cottage. And everything changed. The cottage was the little stone house at the edge of the orchard where Vera had lived and died, and where I'd slept in that chair. For 9 weeks, it wasn't in the will I'd been shown, which meant it had passed to my father with everything else, which meant it was his to sell. A developer wanted the acre it sat on. My mother called me, in the voice she uses when she wants something to sound like a courtesy, and said they were clearing it out before the sale. And did I want to come take any of Gran's things before the dumpster came? A dumpster. For the house my grandmother built her life in. I drove out. On a Saturday morning, I told myself I was just going for the recipe cards and a few photographs. The developer's men weren't coming until Monday. I let myself in with the key I'd never given back. And I stood in the empty front room where the hospital bed had been, and the quiet was enormous. And then I heard my grandmother's voice, clear as the afternoon she'd grabbed my wrist. Where the brick is loose. By the hearth, I went to the fireplace. I ran my hand along the hearthstones, the way I'd once run my hand along everything. Because I am the kind of person who cannot leave a wrong thing alone. The third brick from the left, low, at knee height, moved under my fingers. It had been mortared, and the mortar had been picked out by an old woman with a kitchen knife, some night when nobody was watching. Behind it was a hollow she'd hidden under a loose stone, and in the hollow was a cloth bundle, and in the bundle was a second green tin box, the twin of the one she'd handed me at the end. I sat down on the cold hearth and opened it on my knees. And this is the part where I tell you that I am trained to handle question documents with gloves in controlled light, photographed before they're touched. I did none of that. I just opened it with my bare, shaking hands. On top was a single sheet of unlined paper, covered edge to edge in my grandmother's handwriting. I knew that hand the way I knew my own heartbeat, every looping V, the way her pen dragged on the downstroke in her last years. The little tremor that was hers and could not be drawn by anyone else. It was a will. A holographic will, the kind written entirely in the maker's own hand and signed, which in our state is as valid as any typed page a lawyer ever charged $300 to draft. It was dated the previous November, 4 months before she died. It left the cottage to me. It left me a 1/3 share of Halloway Orchards, and in the middle, in a sentence she'd underlined twice, it said, "My granddaughter Marin is to be paid in full for her care of me. Every month she gave, at fair wage, before 1 acre is divided. They are not to redo my hand. I know what they are." Under it was the second thing. A ledger, in the same hand, dated month by month, 6 years of it. Every month, she'd written my name and a number, $3,400, the fair caregiver, wage for our county, month after month, with a running total she'd kept herself. The last entry was the January before she died. The total at the bottom was $1,600. I checked her arithmetic, because I check everything. $3,400 a month. For 74 months is $250. $1,600. My grandmother, in the fog of her last years, had kept a cleaner set of books on what they owed me than they had ever kept on anything. And in the margin beside the very last entry, in handwriting that had gone shaky and small, she'd written 4 words that I had to read 3 times before they would hold still. They have not paid her. Not a number, not an instruction, just a fact she wanted the dark behind the brick to remember. In case no one else ever would, my grandmother knew she was being robbed of the only currency she had left, which was the truth, and she'd hidden a witness to it in her own wall. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it is the only time in this whole story it happened. I locked the cottage door, and I walked to my car, and I drove halfway down the orchard lane, and I pulled over under the oldest tree she ever grafted, and I cried. Once. Hard. Alone. For about 10 minutes, with my hands on the wheel, and the engine going quiet beside me. Not because I'd lost, because for 6 years I'd half believed the thing they'd taught me, that I was worth nothing, that the care I gave was just what a woman does. Free, and here was my grandmother's own hand, in the dark behind a brick, keeping a record of my worth when no one else on earth would. Then the 10 minutes were up, and I wiped my face, and I stopped being a granddaughter and started being an investigator, because a holographic will hidden in a wall does not win itself, and the people I was about to go up against had already proven they would forge a dead woman's family to get what they wanted. This is the part where I stopped grieving and started building, and I want you to watch how careful I was, because careful is the whole game. I did not drive to my father's house and throw the will on his table, though everything in me wanted to. I have learned the hard way that the satisfying thing and the smart thing are almost never the same thing, and that my family wins every fight that happens out loud. So I did it by the book, my book, the one I write for a living. First, I documented the tin, the way I should have from the start. I photographed it in place at the cottage, the brick, the hollow, the cloth. I had a colleague who owed me nothing, and feared my family not at all drive out and witness me retrieving it, and sign a statement of where it was found. Then I drove the originals to a bank, 2 counties over where no Halloway had ever opened an account, and I sealed them in a safe deposit box, in my name alone. Second, I did to my grandmother's holographic will exactly what I'd do for any client. I compared it against 30 years of her known handwriting, the green ledgers from the orchard, her letters, her recipe cards, the signature on her old driver's license. I will tell you, as the person in the room least inclined to be fooled, that it was hers beyond any question I could raise against it. The tremor was consistent with documented samples from her final years. The ink was period correct. The flow was muscle memory, not drawing. If a forger had made it, that forger was better than anyone I'd testified against in my career. And no such forger had any reason to write a will giving everything to me. Third, and this is where it turned. I finally took out those 2 pages they'd slid across the table. The day they tried to bury me, the disclaimer of interest, the caregiver, waiver, my name in blue ink, notarized by Lyle Brandt, dated the 18th of January. I laid my own real signatures beside the forged ones. 30 of them, going back 15 years, and I saw it the way I'd seen it 100 times in other people's tragedies. The forged signature was drawn, not written. Whoever made it had pressed too hard, paused at the top of the M where my real M flows straight through, added a little hook to the final N that I have never once made in my life. It was a good forgery. It was not my hand. And I knew, because I had spent 3 years learning exactly this, that I could prove it to a court. But proving the signature was fake was only half of it. A good forgery is one person's word against another. I needed the thing that turns a maybe into a fact. I needed who was in the room. Here is what most people don't know about a notary stamp, and what Lyle Brandt was counting on you not knowing. In our state, a notary is required by law to keep a journal. Every single notarization, logged by hand, the date, the document, the signer's signature in the journal itself, and for any document affecting an interest in real property, the signer's right thumbprint pressed into the book. The disclaimer of interest concerned my share of the orchard land. That made it a real property document. That meant the law required Lyle Brandt to take my thumbprint in his journal on the 18th of January, and his journal is not his private property. In a will contest, it is subpoenable. The court can open his book. I sat with that for a long time, and I felt the whole thing settle into a shape. Either Lyle had stamped those documents without journaling them, which is itself a serious violation that would sink his commission, or he had journaled them with a signature and a thumbprint on the 18th of January, the day I was 400 miles away in another state with a plastic badge on my jacket, in which case the journal held a thumbprint that was not mine, and a signature dated a day I could prove I was not there. There was no third door. Whichever way it had happened, the notary's own book was going to convict him. The system my family used to forge me had a rule built into it that they had forgotten, and I was the one person in their lives who knew that rule cold. I sat in the dark of my apartment that night with the 2 forged pages and my 30 real signatures fanned out under the lamp, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the funeral. Not grief, not anger, patience. Keifen, the deep, dangerous patience of a person who has finally stopped trying to be loved by people who would rather forge her than pay her. If you have ever spent years bending yourself smaller so a family would keep you, and then woke up one morning and simply stopped, you know the strange lightness of that night. If that is you, do me a favor and stay with this one to the end, because the part where it turns is coming, and I want you in the room for it. Here is what I want you to understand about why I waited instead of running to my father's house with the proof. My family had taught me one lesson over and over, in the books, in the loan, in every casserole. They win every fight that happens in a hurry, out loud, in a room they control. So I was going to do the opposite of every instinct they'd ever trained into me. I was going to be slow. I was going to be quiet. And I was going to be so completely correct on paper that when the noise finally came, it would have nothing to stand on. If you have ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, you understand the particular calm that came over me then. I wasn't angry anymore. I was a professional. Looking at a case I was going to win, I filed the will contest in probate court the following month on my own behalf, with the holographic will attached. I want to be very clear about one thing, because it matters. And because cheaper stories get it wrong. I never once used my job to do this. I investigate elder fraud for the county, and the first thing I did was call my supervisor and formally recuse myself from anything touching my own family, in writing, so that no one could ever say I'd abused a badge. Everything I did as a private heir following public procedure, with my own lawyer. The slow, honest way. My competence didn't let me cut a corner. My competence was knowing exactly which corners not to cut, so that when I won, nobody could ever say I'd cheated. That is the difference between how my family fights and how I do. They reach for the room. I reach for the rules. And I follow them better than the people who wrote them. The petition did 3 things at once. It asked the court to admit Vera's holographic will. It contested the typed will as the product of undue influence. And it requested a subpoena of Lyle Brandt's notary journal for the month of January. My father's reaction told me everything. A man who'd done nothing wrong sends a lawyer's letter. My father sent my mother. She came to my apartment in the city, which she had visited exactly twice in 15 years, with a casserole, because of course she did. She sat on the edge of my couch like she might need to leave fast, and she said the family was worried about me. That grief did strange things. That I'd found some old paper of Gran's and gotten confused, and there was still time to let this rest and stand with the family. That a contest like this would humiliate my father in the season. The Grange was naming him Orchardist of the Year at the Harvest Festival. 200 people, the whole county, the paper. I let her finish. Then, I asked her one question. I asked her where she'd been on the 18th of January. She didn't answer it. Her eyes flicked sideways, just once. The way a person's do when the question lands somewhere they weren't ready for, and I had part of my answer. I said, I love you, Mom. I am seeing the contest through. She told me, on her way out, the thing she always says, the thing that had ended every argument I'd ever had with this family. Blood signs for blood. Marin, you are choosing the door. I'd heard that line my whole life, usually right before I gave in. This time I just held the door open for her and said, You are right, I am. And I closed it behind her, gently, before she could find the next handle to grab me by. The casserole I left on the step. Some things you don't carry inside. The subpoena went out, and that is when the family stopped being warm and got organized. Kurt came next, because my father never throws the first punch himself. My brother showed up at my office in his good jacket and looked around at the county seal on the wall, like he was pricing it. He didn't bother with a casserole. He got right to the offer. Dressed up as concern, the family would settle. They'd recognize my caregiving, give me a fair number, buy me out of this old paper nonsense, and keep the orchard whole, the way Gran would have wanted. When I asked what the fair number was, he said $60,000. And he said it like a gift. $60,000 for a 1/3 share of $2.1 million in land, plus the cottage, plus $251,600 in care my grandmother had written down in her own hand. A third of $2.1 million is $700,000. Before you add a cent of the rest, they were offering me less than a quarter of what they owed me for the care alone. And, calling it generous, I said no. The concern dropped off his face. Like a coat he was tired of carrying, he leaned in and said, the thing that I filed away and kept. You think a judge is going to take some scribble you found in a wall over a will Lyle drew up clean. Lyle's notary is airtight. Marin, you are embarrassing yourself. And you are embarrassing Dad in his own year. Airtight. He said it so smoothly that I knew, in that instant, that none of them had any idea their airtight notary was about to be opened by a court. They thought the stamp was a wall. They didn't know it was a window. Kurt left telling me I had until the Harvest Festival to be reasonable. I didn't ask what the festival had to do with it. I already had a cold feeling. I knew. My father wanted me folded back into the family story. Publicly. On his big night, the prodigal blessing the king. He'd done it to the whole county's view of Vera's orchard. For 20 years. He thought he could do it to me on a stage. He came himself, once. Near the end. He found me when I drove out to the cottage one last evening to walk the orchard before it stopped being anything to do with me. And he stood at the end of the lane against the orange sky. An old man, in a good coat. For once, he didn't lead with a verdict, he said. Your grandmother and I didn't always agree on how to run this place, but it is a Halloway thing. Marin, it holds because we hold it together. And for 1 second, watching him look at the trees his mother grafted, I saw the fear under all of it. A man terrified that the name dies the day the land divides, that they'll hand him a plaque and forget his face. I felt something open in my chest toward him, and then he closed it himself. Drop the contest, he said, the softness gone. Stand up at the festival and say the family settled it together, or you'll learn how short a Halloway's memory of you can be. There it was. Not a father, a man defending a monument. With his daughter for a sandbag. I said, "Good night, Dad." And I drove home and slept, to my own surprise, because the paper was finally completely on my side, and there is no pillow like that. This is the high point, so let me slow down and let you see every page, because the family certainly did. The notary journal came back to the court under subpoena, and my lawyer and I, and a court clerk, and the family's lawyer, sat in a small windowless room and opened Lyle Brandt's book to the 18th of January. I had photographed 10,000 documents. In my career, my hands had never been quite that still. A notary journal is a humble thing, a bound book with numbered pages, a column for the date, a column for the kind of document, a column where the signer signs, a small box for a thumbprint when the law demands one. People treat it like a formality, a little chore between the stamp and the fee. But a bound book with numbered pages cannot be quietly fixed after the fact without the fixing showing. And that is exactly why the law requires it. It is the one part of a notarization that is built to remember the truth, even when everyone in the room would rather it forgot. My family had spent a lifetime controlling the story. They had never once thought about the book. There was an entry. Lyle had journaled it. The line read, "Disclaimer of interest. Signer Marin Halloway." There was a signature in the signature column. And in the thumbprint box, pressed in dark ink, there was a right thumbprint. The signature in the journal did not match my real hand any more than the one on the disclaimer did. Drawn, not written. The same little hook on the final N, but that was the half I'd already had. The thumbprint was the other half. I had given the court my own inked thumbprints, taken under supervision, a print examiner the court appointed. Not me, never me. Compared them. The thumbprint in Lyle Brandt's journal on the 18th of January. The print of the person who actually stood in that office and pretended to be me did not belong to me. It belonged to a woman whose prints the examiner would later match, to a set the family never imagined would be compared. It was my mother's right thumb. My mother had stood in Lyle Brandt's office on a January morning, while I was 400 miles away, and pressed her own thumb into a notary's book under my name. Blood signs. For blood. She'd meant it more literally than I ever knew. And here is the page that closed the whole thing. The one I laid down last, in court, the way you set down a winning hand without raising your voice. My alibi. A hotel folio with my name and that exact date. 400 miles away, a conference badge. With my photograph, a boarding pass. A receipt from the hotel restaurant, time-stamped 8 a.m. on the 18th of January. 390 miles from Lyle Brandt's stamp. I had not signed those documents because I had not been on the same side of the country as the man who notarized them. And I could prove it down to the minute. I'd ordered coffee. A forged signature is one person's word against another. A forged signature, plus a notary journal with the wrong thumbprint, plus a boarding pass, is not a word against anyone. It is a fact, and facts do not care how the room feels about them. The court-ordered hearing came in the spring, and they brought all of it into one room. My father, my mother, Kurt, Lyle Brandt, who by then had stopped looking at me at all. They expected, I think, a fight, the loud kind. The kind they always win. They didn't get one. They got a woman with a tabbed folder, reading from it in a flat voice. The way I'd read a ledger at an audit, 3 statements. Numbered, no heat in any of them. First, by Wend. I said the holographic will entered into evidence is written entirely in Vera Holloway's hand, and signed by her, dated the November before her death, and that I would stake my professional certification, and had, on its authenticity, and that the court's own examiner had agreed. Second, I said, the disclaimer of interest and the caregiver waiver, dated the 18th of January, bear a signature that is not mine, drawn rather than written, and that I was 400 miles outside the state on that date. And here was the folio, the badge, the boarding pass, and the time-stamped receipt. Third, I said, the notary journal of Lyle Brandt, subpoenaed and opened in this proceeding, contains a thumbprint for that signing that the court's examiner has identified as not belonging to me. I did not say whose it was. I let the examiner's report do that, on the page, in the record, where it would sit forever. I let them be the loud ones for once. My father came up, out of his chair. That is a lie, he said too loud, to a room that had gone very quiet. Put that down, Marin. Kurt was on his feet, saying my name like a warning. My mother had a hand pressed flat to her mouth, looking at my father like she was seeing the foundation of her own life for the first time, which I suppose she was, and I just stood there, calm as still water, and let them be loud, because every word out of their mouths made the paper look truer. My father pointed a shaking finger at the folder and said the thing that had ruled my whole life. Only now it came out cracked instead of commanding. Blood signs for blood. Marin, this stays in the family. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said the only sentence I'd planned, the one I'd been carrying since the night I fanned 30 signatures out under a lamp. I said it quietly, so the room had to lean in. That was always the problem. Dad, blood signs, for blood. But none of you could sign as me. You needed my hand, and you didn't have it. So you took Mom's thumb and called it mine. A court can tell the difference. It just did. He had no answer. For the first time in 38 years, my father, who had a verdict for everything, stood in a room and had nothing to say to me. I did not gloat. I want you to know that, because the wanting to was right there, hot in my throat. 38 years of it. But I'd learned the thing my family never did, that the loud win isn't the real one. So I closed the folder. I squared the edges, the way I'd close a ledger, and I let the record speak in a room, too procedural to interrupt it. Now let me tell you what landed in flat, plain words. Because cold doesn't mean nothing happens. Cold means it happens completely. The court threw out the typed will as the product of undue influence and forged documents. It admitted my grandmother's holographic will in her own hand as her true last word. The cottage became mine. My 1/3 share of the orchard became mine, and the court allowed my caregiver claim against the estate in full, $251,600. The exact number my grandmother had kept behind a loose brick. Paid before 1 acre was divided, exactly as she'd underlined twice. To pay me, the orchard had to sell the very acre the developer had wanted. The acre with the cottage I now owned, except they couldn't sell my cottage, so they sold the lower field instead. The good frontage my father had been protecting his whole life. The name on the new gate down there is not Halloway anymore. You can drive out and see it. Lyle Brandt's notary commission was revoked by the state. His journal entered into a finding of fraud. His name referred to the Bar Association. And a 30-year practice in Cobb's Hollow simply closed its doors. People do not bring their wills to a man whose stamp a court has called a lie. And quietly, around the county, the questions people used to ask about me started getting asked about him and about my father. Instead, there is a written finding in that probate file now, with a county seal on it, that says in plain legal language that the documents disclaiming my interest were forged, and that I was the rightful heir, after a lifetime of being told what I was by people who never had to prove it. There is now a public record, stamped and permanent, that says I was right. If you've ever needed someone with authority to simply say out loud that you were not crazy, that it really did happen the way you knew it did, you understand what that piece of paper is worth. It is worth more than the acre. My father reacted the way men like him always do when the room stops obeying them. He escalated. For 3 weeks, my phone filled with his voicemails, then Kurt's, then my mother's, growing from cold to wheedling to a kind of grief that had no apology anywhere inside it. My father left one that just said the family was praying I'd come to my senses about what I'd done to us. What I'd done to them. I listened to it once and let the rest go unanswered, which I have learned is the only sentence such men actually hear. Kurt showed up at my office one more time, red in the face, talking about lawyers and appeals and family interest, and I said one thing and didn't raise my voice an inch. I said, everything I have, I can show on paper. Every dollar, every signature, every date. Can you? And my brother, who had spent our whole lives showing me he knew more than I did, opened his mouth and closed it, because he and I both knew exactly what his paper looked like, going all the way back to a co-signed loan and a forged thumbprint. For the first time in our lives, the silence was on his side of the table. The harvest festival happened that fall without me. My father did not get his stage moment, because the Grange, when the probate finding became county knowledge, quietly gave the Orchardist of the Year honor to someone else. And the paper that was going to run a warm story about the Holloway legacy ran a different one instead. I didn't engineer that. I'd learned from my family that the loud public takedown is a trap that catches the person who reaches for it. I just told the truth in a courtroom by the rules. And let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop standing in front of it. I refused the cheap version of every ending offered to me. And I want to tell you about the one thread I did not cut, because it is the only soft thing in this whole story. And you've earned it. My niece, June, is 16, Kurt's girl, and she loved her great-grandmother the way I did. The only other person in that family who ever sat with Vera, just to sit. June found my number on her own and texted me. After the hearing, 3 words. She said, "Gran would be glad." Then she said, "Will you teach me her cider recipe? Dad never learned it." Her father runs an orchard and never learned the blend the whole county is named for. That tells you everything about who chased the name and who loved the woman. So last October, the first October, the cottage was mine, June and Bea, and I pressed the first batch of the season at the cottage, just us. For my grandmother's own recipe, the one written on a card in the green tin she'd handed me at the end. The tin I never put down, not the Orchard's festival batch. A small, honest pressing, in a place that was finally, fully mine. June worked the press and asked 100 questions. Bea sat in the good chair and supervised and told us we were both doing it wrong. And laughed. And I thought about the 2 tins. The 2 green tins my grandmother kept. One she handed me in the open, full of recipes, the everyday things she wanted me to have, and one she hid in the dark behind a brick, full of the truth, because she knew what her own son was, and she knew the only weapon that would survive him was her own hand on her own paper, where no man could redo it. My whole life, I'd been the family's record keeper, the one who carried everyone's mistakes. Like rent I owed, it turned out my grandmother had been keeping a record too. All along, in the dark, of exactly what I was worth. Waiting for the one granddaughter who'd know to look behind the loose brick. Anybody can forge a name. Nobody can forge. Who was in the room? Bea said that to me on a cold step when I had nothing. And a notary's own book proved it to a court when I had everything to lose. My mother could press her thumb in a book and call it mine. She could not press it into the 9 weeks. I slept in that chair. She could not forge the months in my grandmother's ledger. She could not forge who was in the room when it mattered. And in the end, the room was the only evidence that ever counted. My mother came to the cottage once, that winter, alone. She walked through the small bright rooms and stood a long time at the hearth. At the brick, which I'd left loose. Then she found me and said the family missed me, that I'd made my point, that surely now I could let it rest and stand with them again. The old pull was there. It always will be. But I'd learned to feel it without obeying it. I said, "The door isn't locked, Mom. It never was. You can come here anytime. But I am done asking your permission to be worth something." She told me, softer than she'd ever said it. "Blood signs for blood, Marin. You chose the door." I'd heard that line my whole life, and it had always landed like a sentence. This time, I just smiled. You are right, I said. I did choose the door. I just walked through a different one than you meant. And the next time you sign my name, Mom, remember that a court can read whose hand was really in the room. She didn't have an answer for that. She stayed for a cup of cider, which was more than I expected. And when she left, she touched my arm at the threshold. Just for a second, and didn't try to grab anything by it. It was the most honest thing she'd done in years. If you take one thing from my story, take this. Your worth was never theirs to hand you, or to take back. They can forge your signature. They cannot forge your life. And sometimes the truth you need is sitting in the dark behind a loose brick, in the handwriting of the one person who saw you clearly, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach in. That is my story. 2 green tins, 1 loose brick, and a name that was never as clean as the town believed. If this reminded you that being the family member who is counted on for everything and counted as nothing is its own kind of theft, comment the word invisible below. And let's find each other in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear tonight that their worth isn't anyone's to give or take. Drop a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.